This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Dissent, a democratic socialist magazine of politics and culture. Dissent's spring issue, out now, focuses on the global right, assessing the state of right-wing parties and movements around the world, and examining the emergence of a radical right-wing vision of world order. The issue includes writing on Israel's illiberal constitutional model, India's hegemonic BJP, and Italy's quest for international legitimacy, as well as on the institutions and networks that train far-right leaders and circulate far-right ideas. Also included are articles on the prosecutions of Stop Cop City activists, the failure of Germany's memory culture, intellectuals in the labor movement, and much more. Dissent's spring issue is out now, online and in print. Subscribe today to get your copy at dissentmagazine.org/subscribe. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the 11th episode of Thawra, The Dig's rolling series on 20th century Arab politics, with historian Abdel Razzaq Takriti. Thawra is Arabic for revolution. It's a word that contains historical multitudes, diverse political radicalisms and revolts that have swept across Arab lands over the past century. The ecstatic utopian possibilities of 1958 in Iraq, Syria, and Egypt started to fall apart fast. In Iraq, Abdul Qasim had led a free officers' coup that overthrew the imperialist-aligned Hashemite monarchy and brought the Iraqi Communist Party to the heights of power. But as we discussed in the last episode, Qasim, after suppressing the Baathists and the Nasserists, started to clip the communist wings. In 1961, things in Iraq got even more complicated as Kurds, led by Mullah Mustafa Barzani, a one-time Qasim ally, launched the Aylul Revolution against the central state. This was the most serious quest for Kurdish self-determination since the Republic of Mahabad in 1940s Iran. Meanwhile, this Iraqi Kurdish rebellion was openly backed by Iran. More secretly and controversially, Barzani received support from Israel, behind the backs and against the wishes of many of his supporters. In February 1963, all these conflicts and contradictions in Iraq came to a head. Baathist, Nasserist, and other nationalist military officers overthrew Qasim in a coup. After which, the Baathists unleashed a wave of bloody terror against Iraqi communists, the region's most important reservoir of grassroots left-wing power. The other giant event of 1958 was Syria uniting with Egypt in the United Arab Republic, a superstate ruled by Nasser that for so many seemed to be a giant first step toward fulfilling the pan-Arab dream of a unified Arab nation strong enough to defeat Western imperialism and Zionism. In 1961, the UAR was effectively abolished after officers in Syria staged a coup that led to Syria's secession. While Nasser continued to maintain strong support in Syria, or what at the time was called the UAR's northern region, he had also alienated many Syrian military officers, nearly all political parties, and also the bourgeoisie. Nasser had weakened officers' political power and relocated them far from home to Egypt. Political parties were banned, and Nasser appointed Syrian officer Abdel Hamid Siraj to oversee repression of dissent. And the economic powers that be in Syria, they were furious at Nasser's nationalizations and moves to break monopolies. Syria's secession and the effective end of the United Arab Republic was a cataclysmic event for Syria, Egypt, and the entire Arab world. And the secessionist governments that followed the coup ruled on behalf of the Syrian bourgeoisie. Syria reoriented toward the West and moved to reverse Nasser's nationalizations and other policies deemed hostile to capital. Secession was, unsurprisingly, a huge blow to Nasser and to the Arab nationalist project that he had led. In response, Nasser shifted Egypt to the left, embracing the concept of Arab socialism. But things were not settled in Syria. The Syrian secessionist government was then overthrown by a Ba'ath military coup in March 1963. And a reminder here for listeners, all these events were happening in multiple countries simultaneously. The 1963 Ba'ath coup in Syria occurred less than a month after the February 1963 Iraqi coup that overthrew Qasim. Indeed, the Iraqi coup inspired Ba'athist officers to act in Syria. But even as Ba'athists seized power in Syria and Iraq, their party was fragmenting between different nation-states, between ideologies, and between military and civilian leadership. For example, the heavily Palestinian-Jordanian branch of the Ba'ath Party had rebelled against the party's leadership's growing hostility toward Nasser. Most importantly, in 1959, Syrian Ba'athist officers who Nasser had stationed in Egypt formed a Syrian Ba'ath military committee. It was a rival base of power within the party, led by figures like Salah Jadid and Hafez al-Assad. It was a power base that in a 1966 coup sidelined the party's traditional civilian leadership. Figures that you know well by now, like Michel Aflaq and Salah al-Din al-Battar. This dominance of Syrian Ba'ath military officers would play out in a sequence of events that ended with Hafez al-Assad seizing total power in 1970. The coups continued in Iraq as well. Just 9 months after the Ba'ath had helped lead the coup overthrowing Qasim, Nasserists and other nationalists would move against the Ba'ath in a November 1963 coup, firmly establishing Abdul Salam Arif, Qasim's one-time ally and co-conspirator, as leader. But the Ba'ath would be back with a more decisive coup of their own in 1968, a coup that would bring Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr alongside his deputy Saddam Hussein to power, an event that, along with Assad's 1970 coup in Syria, we'll get into in a lot more detail as we're entering this series' final episodes. Why dwell for so long on these series of cascading defeats for left-wing and progressive projects in the region? The rival radical projects of pan-Arabism and communism suffered huge blows in the early 1960s. So did Nasser and Qasim, the era's most significant Arab anti-imperialist leaders. Meanwhile, the Ba'ath, once an ideological and idealistic party, became increasingly dominated by military men who made it into an instrument for raw domination. In large part, these defeats signal the changing coordinates for politics in the Middle East, the beginning of the end of a certain kind of left-wing project, and the rise of a new kind of military regime, raising the slogans of social liberation and anti-imperialism, while prioritizing power consolidation. Before we get this episode started, The Dig is a political education project that aims to give the left and organizers everywhere the knowledge that's required to sharpen our analysis and methods of struggle. That's why we give every episode away for free with no paywall. But that's only possible because listeners like you support the podcast at patreon.com/thedig. If you spend a few hours with us every month listening to the work we put out on the pod, and you can afford to, please contribute now. That's patreon.com/thedig. Click the link in the show notes. This podcast is unusual, and so is our financial model. Please do your part if you can. All contributors get our excellent newsletter sent directly to your email inbox. Depending on where you live and how much you donate, we also have goodies to send you by mail. I also wanted to remind you to please let a friend know about Thawra. Or if you're on social media, please let everyone know about Thawra. And then lastly, to my listeners in the UK, I am coming to London, my first time ever, and I'll be hosting a live Dig interview on July 26th with Yes, that is right. Jeremy Corbyn and Laleh Khalili on global politics, internationalism, and the war on Palestine, alongside Verso podcast host Eleanor Penny. And it's a podcast doubleheader. Before our Dig Verso discussion, Dalia Gabriel will interview Thea Riofrancos and Asad Rahman on capitalism and the climate crisis and other such topics for the Macrodose podcast. The event on July 26th is at Union Chapel, and I'll put a link where you can buy tickets in the show notes. Thanks. And here's Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. A scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements, he's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website, an incredible resource that'll be back online soon. In September 1961, officers in Syria staged a coup and declared Syria independent of the United Arab Republic. But before we get to that, I think we need to step back a couple years and fill out an important piece of the backstory. In 1959, a Syrian Ba'ath military committee formed in Cairo, and its leaders included figures who would become very important over the years that followed. People like Salah Jadid, Hafiz al-Assad, and Mohammed Umran. What was the Syrian Ba'ath Military Committee? Why was it formed when it was? And how did it relate to the Ba'ath civilian leadership at the time? Because my understanding is the Ba'ath civilian leadership at the time that the military committee was formed did not even know that it existed.
Daniel, this is a very sensitive question in Ba'ath history. We could even say it is probably the most sensitive question in the history of the party. It is a question that has consumed the thought of many Ba'athist prominent figures, including some of its leading theorists, such as Dr. Munif Razzaz, who wrote a book about this subject called The Bitter Experience, التجربة المرة. And it's not an easy question to answer. If we want to understand its circumstances, we have to look back at the composition of the party and the different tendencies that existed within it. Now, according to Dr. Razzaz, and I tend to agree with him, the party was confronted with two dilemmas. It had a plan for revolutionary transformation along nationalist lines with a socialist bent. Dr. Razzaz, for example, very much influenced by Fabian socialist ideas. These are not the most radical out there, but they definitely would be, considered to be firmly within the social democratic arena. His type of ideology was adopted by a good section of the party. I would say it reflected a certain trend within the party. There were others that had different social base, like Akram Hourani that we've discussed earlier. There were also the classical ideas of Michel Aflaq that we had discussed earlier. So all of this is to say that you always had a wing that had ideas, but their ideas, however, were very much not focused on the question of how to seize power. They had a certain conception of what the Arab nation is. They had a certain, let's say, obsession with certain notions such as achieving Arab unity. But when it came to how to achieve power, this was always a dilemma. In Syria, in the days when there was the parliamentary life, they participated in parliaments, even though they were well aware of the fact that parliaments were deficient and that they were always going to be dominated by parties that reflected the upper classes in society and the bourgeoisie. At the same time, they were hesitant about the military, but over the years, as we have seen, they ended up flirting with the military and establishing military committees because they were beginning to see that perhaps one of the easiest pathways to power is the military. So this was one of the dilemmas that were confronted by the Ba'athists. When it came to the military in particular, part of the problem was that if you did not start cells in the military, then you could be eliminated by other parties that do establish cells in the military. And that became, in a way, an unstoppable process in the history of places like Syria, but also Iraq. And again, I must remind our listeners, because sometimes you have these people that try to claim that this problem is inherent in the militaristic nature of these societies. The first entry of the military into Arab modern political life was a CIA orchestrated entry.
In 1949 with Hosni al-Zaim in Syria.
That's right. And that's why we've emphasized this throughout in this DIG series. This was not a minor event because it established a very serious and dangerous precedent, but also it had a snowball effect. You have a situation where everything accumulates, everything grows, and then it becomes unstoppable. And it becomes a self-propelling force, this military intervention in politics. So we have then an attempt by Nasser to deal with this dilemma in Syria and with the nature of the interference of political parties in the military in Syria by taking a very punitive line towards parties within the military and by essentially marginalizing the Syrian military tout corps. He engages in a series of moves where, first of all, officers that graduated from the Homs Military Academy, which was notorious for its heavy politicization and ideological debates and party life, they were targeted for moves from the northern province to the southern one of the United Arab Republic, meaning that they were sent to Egypt, many of them. Some of them were even imprisoned. The entire Palestinian officer corps in the Syrian army was put under surveillance and many of its members were imprisoned, sometimes falsely. Many of these were Nasser loyalists even, but they were suspected to be, ideologically active or rumored to be. Now, Abdel Hamid al-Sarraj was put in charge of the intelligence structure in Syria at the time, and Nasser trusted in him greatly. Nasser's envoy in Syria, his viceroy in Syria, Abdel Hakim Amir, who was his right-hand man in Egypt, the most prominent person in Egypt aside from Nasser, because he headed the Egyptian army, was put in charge of Syria. He trusted in the intelligence capacities of Sarraj. Sarraj and his officers were spying on the military. They were interfering in almost every aspect of life. And with these different moves from the northern sector to the southern one, from the northern province to the southern one, with the feeling on the part of Syrian officers that they were being marginalized, you had the development of resentments, and you had the development of a feeling that they should regroup back into their old party affiliations. So you had the development of different politicized factions within the Syrian military, and these often reflected some regional dimensions, although not exclusively so. But they definitely had a regional element to them, or regionalized element to them. For example, the dominant group that carried out the coup against the United Arab Republic, that ended the United Arab Republic in 1961, was led primarily by Damascene officers. These were officers that belonged to Damascus families through kinship networks and so on, connected to the bourgeoisie in Syria. Some of those sections were harmed by nationalization programs. And they, as a result, were involved in airing their, basically, grievances in their own circles. They had a certain language amongst themselves. They had a certain understanding. They would have known each other through networks and family networks. Similarly, you had these networks developing in amongst the ranks of officers that came from the coastal area, which was predominantly Alawite in composition. These were increasingly gravitated to the Ba'ath. They included Ba'athist officers, but this was the type of Ba'ath that was very different than the civilian one. These did not come from the same social background, did not come from the same educational background, did not have the same history of involvement in the political struggles of Syria. These were young men who were in the army, and they had a strong sense of a regional affiliation and, to some extent, and sometimes people overemphasize this, a sectarian bond. In my view, by the way, I of course, there's a sectarian element to the rest of the story, and we're going to talk about it more in a second. But it's important to note this often had to do more about ensuring loyalty and ensuring group cohesion than necessarily having a sectarian vision for the country.
It wasn't about an ideological commitment to sectarianism. It was the sort of practicalities of community, family sort of bonds. And it's only later that that sort of like practical orientation towards sectarianism develops sort of like a articulated ideology of that sectarianism as an end in and of itself.
Right. So like a Machiavellian character like Hafiz al-Assad, for example, who is not a brilliant theorist, is not a particularly intellectual person, but he's very street smart. He's a great calculator and a political calculator in many ways. He's a very calculating person. He's more concerned with achieving power than with anything else. And if that means I'm going to empower my family and I'm going to empower people who come from my region and people who share with me the same religious background, I'll do it. Similarly, he's mirrored in Iraq by Saddam Hussein in many ways, in very interesting ways. Although somehow nowadays Assad's reputation in certain circles has been left unscathed, whereas Saddam gets trashed. They're actually two sides of the same coin.
Latakia is in Syria what Takrit becomes in Iraq.
Yeah, in many ways. But neither of them is really actually genuinely sectarian as people claim. At the end of the day, yes, there is this dimension, but there is a lot of evidence that they had a broader vision as well. But for them, power trumped all. And that's my own personal assessment. Others, by the way, have a very different outlook on this. They will say these are just purely sectarian figures. There's nothing else. There's no class dynamic. There's no regional dynamic. There's zero ideological dynamic. They'll tell you that. I don't think so. I think it's a very complex process, but there's definitely a very pronounced sectarian dimension to it.
So how did that military revolt that pulled Syria out of the United Arab Republic in 1961 take shape? What role did various political forces play? You just mentioned Damascene officers. And what, generally speaking, did the coup reflect about the 3-year experiment in union with Egypt?
Yeah, and again, this is a very difficult question, Daniel, because the literature on it in English is not that great. I actually held a special conference to deal with this question back in the day on the 50th anniversary of the United Arab Republic in 2008. Reem Abul Fadl, who was a scholar of Nasserism and a colleague of mine at SOAS, University of London, and I had hosted it in Oxford back in the day in 2008. Every week we'd have a speaker speaking on the United Arab Republic. It was a series that was supposed to reflect on it. The most important contribution came from Mohammed Jamal Barout, who is a political historian of Syria. Barout's argument was that people often overemphasize the connection between the Damascene officers that actually carried out the coup and the bourgeois interests. He's saying that while the bourgeois interests actually wanted to overthrow Nasserism in general,
because of all the nationalizations and whatnot.
The nationalizations, capital was threatened, because of that. And there were monopolies in Syria. He was calling for the breakup of the monopolies. Some of them also considered that there were inefficiencies in the public sector. under the Nasser's rule, which is probably partially true but exaggerated. Obviously you will have inefficiencies when you have the military intervening in economic planning. But anyways, in any case, you had this situation where the standard story is Nasser did not take into account the economic needs of the country, the differences between Syria and Egypt, and he was hostile to the bourgeois class. The bourgeois class essentially rebelled against him and formed an alliance with the parties that had been marginalized under his rule, and they overthrew him. Now, in general terms, that makes sense. But there are some particularities to the coup itself. What's left here is, what about the officers themselves? What Jamal Barout's research shows, and it's too bad it hasn't been published to this day, by the way, and this is why I feel bad about it, because it's an amazing intervention. He did interviews with all of these people and found a host of important documents from that period. Really incredible research. And what he found was basically, on the whole, we must distinguish between actual desires and objectives of these officers and the desires and objectives of the political forces surrounding them, which made use of their coup, which essentially used their coup to pursue their objectives. But they did not necessarily have the same ideological outlook as these officers. So Abdel Karim Nahlawi, Muhib al-Hindi, these people, and especially Muhib al-Hindi even, used to refer to what they did with the coup as jarimat al-infisal, the crime of separation or separatism. Like he's talking about himself. He even, in a very dramatic act, one time wanted to shoot himself. He put a gun to his head, and his comrades had to come because they were horrified. These people a lot of them were actually genuine Arab nationalists. They considered that they committed a grave sin, a great crime, a big mistake. What Jamal argues, and I actually agree with him, and this is very much runs against the common wisdom and the standard literature, both Arabic and English. But I think he's very right on this, and he definitely is very convincing in the material he marches around it. What he shows is this started as an internal army problem. The officers felt disempowered, they felt marginalized, they felt that they were not treated equally with their Egyptian counterparts and peers. They felt that essentially the Syrian army was being treated unequally and unfavorably. They were incensed at being moved away from their homes and cities and villages and being sent to Egypt. And in Egypt, they were not given consequential roles. They were essentially being paid to sit around and play cards and do nothing. Okay, and at the same time, they were witnessing a very heavy-handed set of purges being taken by Sarraj and the security services and Nasser's men in Egypt. They had serious grievances. So this was essentially initially what we would call in Arabic haraka matlabiyya. It's a demand-based movement within the army that then got taken over essentially by the political parties. And the political parties, as well as the bourgeois classes, had lots of access to grind when it came to Nasser, And we know this because A, he disbanded them. B, when he disbanded them, he did not actually take them seriously. He did not involve them in government rule in an active way. And that incensed the most important of his potential partners, which was, of course, Michel Aflaq and the Ba'ath.
So you've laid out this scenario here where there's a demand-based movement within the army that's not necessarily been thought of or intended to be a secessionist coup that's then opportunistically hijacked by political parties. And there are a lot of different political parties who have a variety of grievances with Nasser and the UAR, but one principal grievance that unites them all is that Nasser has banned all political parties. So that's something they all have in common. But then again, looking back, listeners will recall that Ba'athists played this key role in driving union in the first place, naively believing that they would be the brain to Nasser's muscle in this unified superstate, so that the prohibition of political parties actually would just eliminate their rivals like the communists, but be fine for them. Where were the Baathists on succession? My sense is that it proved extraordinarily divisive, not only within Syria, but within the Iraqi Ba'ath Party as well.
Yeah, I mean, here's the problem, Daniel, is that there is no consistency in the Ba'ath on this. So on the one hand, they start with, like, we want Nasser to come, okay? We want the union. But that's based on a set of expectations that were, of course, not met once the union was established. So then there is a turn that takes place within the party. Aflaq actually calls for a meeting in 1959, and it's a very famous meeting because it caused a split within the party, where he actually said, now we must resist Nasser's government. And this causes the dissension of the Ba'ath's second largest branch, aside from the Syrian branch at the time. Because at the time, the second largest branch was actually the Jordanian branch, i.e. the Jordanian and Palestinian branch. The Palestinians and Jordanians made up a very, very important force within the Ba'ath Party in the 1950s. So their branch, and this is recounted very evocatively in the memoirs of members of that branch, especially Bahjat Abu Gharbiya talks about it. He attended some of these parties. He's a legendary Palestinian figure. But also like people like Abdullah Rimawi, who was the senior most Palestinian Jordanian Ba'athist. He comes in that meeting and he's like, no way, we cannot actually break with Nasser. This is our dream, is unity. We have to insist on unity. Even though there are flaws to this experiment, even though Nasser is not treating us in the best way possible, we have to allow this process to work. Aflaq considered this to be naive thinking, whereas Abdullah Rimawi considered Aflaq's thinking to be inconsistent and potentially dangerous. It was placing the interests of the party over the interests of the greater experiment that the party had always dreamt of, the experiment of unifying the Arab countries, and the most important of which were actually Iraq, Syria, and Egypt. So if you're already destroying the union between Syria and Egypt, then what next for the whole project? Nothing will work. The union will never be possible again. This was their worry. And they were right. Aflaq was also right. The party did not stand a chance under Nasser's rule. He's not interested in parties. Okay, so which side do you pick? I don't know. You leave it to history. And if you're a Ba'athist, you'd have to stimulate that experiment. For us that are just trying to write the history of the period, it's good for us to understand the roles of each of the players and the way they were thinking and the logic that they were engaging in. Now, that leads to a major schism in the party. When the 61 coup happens, effectively leading to the dissolution of the UAR, we have immediately, first of all, a popular uprising against secession. So you have here popular mobilizations going on. And by the way, this brings in a new kid to the block, which is the movement of Arab nationalists. Prior to 1961, it was still a movement, trying to find its place in this bigger arena. It was a movement that has achieved some following, but it was not nearly anything as big as the Ba'ath, for example. But over the context of mobilizing against the secession, it had acquired some popularity. There were also run-of-the-mill Nasserists in Syria. There were lots of people that liked Nasser, supported Nasser. When Nasser visited Syria, you should see the demonstrations. It's unbelievable. His media was still popular in Syria. And there were actual Nasserists there. So this was another dimension to consider here. So you had, on the one hand, the parties immediately capitalizing on what took place and instituting and formalizing the secession. But then simultaneously, there are social forces and political forces that are calling for re-establishing union along more equitable lines. The main obstacle they're confronting is Nasser was like, nah, okay? Let me be here very clear about Nasser and his thinking. Nasser could have suppressed the coup. He could have actually even carried out a major move. Technically speaking, could have been classified as a putsch, could have been classified as a mutiny, and he could have landed troops from Egypt and actually suppressed it. He did not opt to do that. Okay, it would have been a very bloody outcome. It would have opened a very different scenario. But I want our listeners to also bear that in mind. Sometimes we do these little counterfactual exercises, me and you, Daniel, because they just help us to think about the scenario. He chose not to, which then left the ball in the court of the Syrian forces allied to him. They come in and they're like, who's going to defend the union? Who's going to defend? We believe in this union. We do not want the solution of it. This is what we fought for all our lives in some cases. Many of these people grew up on the idea of Arab unity. In Syria, it's a very popular idea, Daniel, because remember, Syria lost much of its hinterlands, much of its countryside, its surrounding areas. Parts of Syria were dismembered from the mother country in a way. So the idea of Arab unity was very popular. People often used to refer to Syria as qalb al-urub al-nabid, the heart, the beating heart of Arabism. So for something like secession to happen without political forces actually rallying around it and without having some social forces rallying around it is not going to happen.
The period after the secessionist coup included, I think, 2 other failed coup attempts, multiple governments, the return of a lot of characters that we've discussed in past episodes, and all the while, Nasser, with the Voice of the Arabs, this radio station that's still giantly popular in Syria and all over the region, vociferously attacked the secessionist government as a reactionary regime. So what sort of secessionist regime was it that ruled Syria from the 1961 secession up until the 1963 Ba'athist coup that overthrew it?
So we have like these characters that come in. Essentially, everybody who had issues with the union comes in and becomes part of the scene. So take somebody like Ma'mun al-Kuzbari, who becomes the president of Syria initially after the coup. He's from a Damascus family, and it's a prominent Damascus family. So we have here the return of the notables in some ways. He was a president of the Syrian Bar Association, and he had been active with that very sketchy character that we spoke about earlier, Adib al-Shishakli. He was actually quite close to Adib al-Shishakli, but somehow managed to survive the overthrow of Shishakli and make a comeback. Now, he comes in for a brief period. It doesn't last very long. He's one of these figures that's close to these Damascene officers in some ways. There are family ties and so on. But again, he lasts for a couple of months. And what that shows is the fact that you don't have now any sense of direction or political clarity on the part of those that carried out the coup. Okay. Now, we have after him Nazim al-Qudsi coming in. There was a very brief somebody in between, not even worth mentioning, Izzat al-Nus, but really it's Nazim al-Qudsi that matters to the story. Nazim goes on on a mission that's essentially the bourgeois program.
Reversing Nasser's nationalizations.
Yeah. I'm going to reverse everything. Okay. Who's going to benefit from that? Former factory owners who had lost something, landowners. And at the same time, you're having also realignment with the West going on, realignment with all the conservative regimes that are anti-Nasser. So Syria suddenly is becoming close to Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and the United States is very excited about this guy, Nazim al-Qudsi. They love him. He's striking different deals with them. And, from his perspective, that makes sense. This is an American University of Beirut a graduate. He had PhDs from prominent institutions, from University of Geneva. He comes from, again, a well-known Aleppo family. Yeah, so this is someone that has a background in the old politics, but also in the old alignments, and is definitely out there on a mission to destroy everything that Nasser tried to do in Syria. That's not going to be compatible with other forces that have participated in overthrowing the United Arab Republic. That's not the agenda that the Ba'ath, for example, was promoting. It's certainly not the agenda of the movement of Arab nationalists, which, as we mentioned, was beginning to appear increasingly on the scene. It's not even the agenda of the communists. Of course not. The greater alignment with the West and so on. So how do we understand this period? We understand it as a period where there was still instability in the direction. Had there been a clear political force associated with the military officers, the Damascene officers that had carried out the coup, we would have had a very different trajectory going on. But they did not have a clear, direction to them.
How did Syrian secession impact Nasser's power and stature in Egypt, but also, of course, regionally and even globally? He was riding high, as we've talked about, after the conflict over the Baghdad Pact, standing up to the tripartite aggression over Suez, all of which helped propel Egypt and Syria into forming the UAR, with what you described in an earlier episode as being accompanied by almost this euphoric sense of destiny being fulfilled. Was secession a huge blow?
Secession was a huge blow, yeah. I mean, it was to begin with, I mean, think about it this way. Nasser had become the icon of pan-Arabism. An important part of Nasser's philosophy of national security and of dealing with international affairs was the idea of creating a large pan-Arab project. He knew and understood that in geopolitical terms, Egypt cannot do it alone when it came to achieving genuine independence or economic development. And it had to have a clear understanding of its Arab neighborhood, and ideally, if it could achieve some unity formula that is sustainable, that would be great. Now, of course, that thinking evolved over time in the case of Nasser, but when he made the move of going to the United Arab Republic, a move that initially he was not enthusiastic about because he was worried about it being ill-planned and he was worried about the fact that the countries were not economically integrated. I mean, this was the dilemma of pan-Arabist thinking throughout, Daniel, it is true that these countries have enormous cultural connectivities, and that continues to be the case to this very day. They have religious commonalities. They have, of course, a profound linguistic identification, a shared history, everything you can imagine. But what is also true is that there were boundaries that were created by colonialism that meant that economic exchange was limited. It meant that social classes, their cohesion was not always existent, and in some cases it was non-existent. So, for example, when it comes to Egypt, for example, and Syria, their dominant social classes were not actually in direct contact or did not have profound immediate relations. There were abstract relations, and they're important relations. The cultural, the realm of the imagination, the realm of culture is very important because that has to do with one's identity. But at the same time, there's more to politics than that. And that includes the economy, as we know. It includes the material dimension. That was very weak between at least Syria and Egypt, and it was bound to produce difficulties. Nasser was well aware of that, but nevertheless, he thought that he could, through creating a very strong state, a centralizing state that he could actually basically essentially force through a union that would work. History proved otherwise. It didn't have to be the case. There were other possibilities. The Damascene officers might not have rebelled potentially. They could have had their rebellion not been invested politically by other forces in a secessionist direction. Things could have worked out differently. But we don't know. In any case, Nasser felt that this was a big blow. It was a blow to his prestige. He was the most important Arab leader, and this was his flagship experiment. And it's coinciding with the decline of his relationship with important countries like Saudi Arabia. He was about to head towards conflict with them. And already things were tense. And we'll talk about that later on. He was confronted with a different regional map, challenges coming from Europe and America's relationship with the Israeli settler colony. So when it comes to the state of Israel, this was the time when the Arab governments discovered that West Germany had been funneling huge amounts of weapons to the state of Israel. They discovered that in 1961 it was leaked, and they were finding that there were enormous nuclear developments that were potentially happening. All sorts of information was coming out about growing military capacity there. So you definitely don't want secession in that environment. If secession were to take place, what's going to happen to Syria? Whose orbit will it fly in? And obviously, we know from what happened under the government of secession, especially the government that we alluded to of Nazim al-Qudsi, that Syria went into the Western orbit. These were a set of challenges that were confronting Nasser, and it was a very difficult thing for him to do. His response was actually to turn to the left more so. So he announces an expedited program of nationalization. This is the moment when he really, really commits and starts developing this concept of Arab socialism. We see an increasing Egyptian turn to the left within Egypt. And in a way, that's to kind of fill the void that's happening after the secession, but also send a signal that this secession was an outcome of a class crisis, a class struggle. It's the bourgeois classes that had carried it through, and these are classes that are seen as complicit with colonialism. And Nasser certainly wants to paint them in that brush. So he expedites the nationalization program. He expedites different aspects of socialist policy. Essentially, takes the opportunity of the secession because once you have a secession going on, you're then confronted again with the question of, well, what's the constitution of the new state? You have essentially a new state coming in. Where is it going to go? And this is when Egypt has to deal with that question, and this is where it produces this very ambitious document, which essentially is a new charter for the country, in which socialism appears for the first time throughout in very explicit ways.
Let's pivot back to Iraq, where we left off last episode. An escalating series of conflicts engulfed all the various currents that had pushed the July Revolution to victory in 1958, including, as we discussed, Qasim moving to marginalize his once staunch allies in the Communist Party. Hana Batatu writes, quote, "It seems curious that Qasim should have been whittling down the strength of the communists, even as the nationalists were sharpening their weapons." We talked a bit about how this relationship deteriorated. My question here is, how did this deteriorating relationship with Qasim and the difficult situation that put the Communist Party in, how did that all play out within the Communist Party with a left faction that argued for a revolutionary break with Qasim against a dominant right faction that continued to argue that defending Qasim against reactionary plots had to remain the top priority.
We're dealing with dilemmas that are confronted by all these parties. They had gone through major experiences in the 50s. They have baggage now, big baggage. There are parties that came into prominence in the late 40s, and they're basically the post-independence parties that have accumulated baggage throughout the 50s. And now, in the opening of the new decade, opening years of the 1960s, they have to figure out what they're going to do with this baggage. So, in the case of the communists, they have a similar dilemma to the Ba'ath, which is, what is our relationship to government? Where does party stand in relation to government? Where does the party stand in relation to the military? And their problem here is they put all their eggs in Qasim's basket. And they're stuck with him in some ways. They brought him great prominence. They saluted him. They were the first to chant, there is no leader but Abdel Karim. You know, in Arabic it rhymes. La za'im illa Abdel Karim. Okay? They're the ones that were really dependent on this, and they didn't know what to do now. And in fact, one of their leading members was, in a famous statement, said, like, how long are we going to be carrying this guy on our shoulders while he's suppressing us? Qasim himself, of course, had a dilemma because he did not want just one party to dominate. He's not a communist. He doesn't want the communists to dominate. He doesn't want to dispose of them. He knows that they're important for the continuation of his rule, but he has to diversify and rely on different sections and elements. But ultimately, that leads to the destruction of both him and the communists. And what this meant for the communists then is that they had to come up with a decision on what is to be done. Is there a potential for seizing power, or is there no potential for seizing power? Should they seize power? Should they keep on going on the defensive while Qasim is essentially clipping their wings? Or should they move forward and really capitalize on the fact that they have army officers and they have people that could ensure potential success of any military move that they would do, in tandem with, of course, a very strong political intervention. What ends up happening is the Communist Party decides not to move against Qasim, despite the fact that many of its party organs were being suppressed by him. Many of its committees were being shut down by him. Many of its unions were affected by him. But they decide that it's risky business. And that's something that later on gets debated in the party. And there were big debates in the party that probably amongst the older communists to this very day, they wonder what should they have done? Because that was the period when they've achieved the greatest amount of power possible in Iraq for them. It was a moment of a great ascendancy, but they had lost it.
Amid all these conflicts, in 1961, a decade of warfare began between the Iraqi state and Kurdish forces, a war that Kurds call the Aylul Revolution. Why did that war break out? Was it that Qasim had failed to follow through on pledges that he'd made to Mullah Mustafa Barzani in 1958 after the July Revolution, pledging Kurdish autonomy? And then how did the war with the Kurds, a war that would continue in various ways across successive Iraqi regimes for decades, more narrowly, how did it shape this period that we're talking about here, Iraqi politics in the year and a half between the war's beginning in 1961 and the February 1963 coup that we haven't gotten to yet, but this coup that would overthrow Qasim?
So with Qasim, we have a character that is trying to emerge as a proper national leader. And he's trying accordingly to balance all the different social forces that are operating in the country, which is why he invites back Mullah Mustafa Barzani. Mullah Barzani had been in exile in the Soviet Union for a very, very long time. He had participated in a Kurdish experiment in Iran, the Republic of Mahabad. Since then he went into exile. He'd been out of Iraq for a very long time by the time Abdel Qasim came. But Abdel Qasim wanted to establish alliances that would allow for him to reduce his dependency on different political parties and figures. He also wanted to basically have a counterbalance to the communists, a counterbalance to the Arab nationalists, a counterbalance to different forces that are active in the country. And here, he already had some Kurdish relationships with some of the major feudal landowning families, for example. But he wanted to balance that out with a feudalist who had nationalist credentials, or Kurdish nationalist credentials, like Mullah Mustafa Barzani. He's still definitely operating along tribalist lines and kinship networks and so on, and is interested in pursuing family power in Kurdish politics, but at the same time, so he is a traditionalist in many ways, but still, he can counterbalance, and through doing that, he could be a useful asset for Abdel Qasim. And as a historian, I want to share with you my thought process around characters like that. I like to detect patterns. And much of what we do is analysis. And sometimes you get a sense of a character's set of practices, how you arrive at a conclusion about how they do the things they do and why they do them. When you start detecting a pattern, you feel like you've understood this character better. And when I analyze somebody like Qasim, what I always notice is that there's this pattern where he's trying to make sure that no force is too strong and no force is too weak. This is the game he was playing in Iraq. And it's kind of a smart game, especially in a country that has so many different social forces operating within it. And where state institutions have not yet been developed in a strong enough fashion to be able to take an independent life, or at least a stable life, in relation to these social forces. I mean, there is no state that is independent from the social forces surrounding it, but sometimes you can have stable formulas for resolving different class conflicts, different social cleavages, and so on and so forth. The difficulty in, of course, the post-colonial order globally is that was not always available. More often than not, these newly independent countries did not inherit strong enough institutions or a formula that could stabilize society in an independent manner, because their institutions were designed to serve colonialism. They were not designed to basically create new egalitarian formulas or to create futures that allowed for different disempowered groups to achieve greater social justice. So that's a dilemma that exists worldwide. Qasim's solution to it was he wanted to create some form of Iraqi patriotism and to balance social forces against each other. That's why he invites back Mullah Barzani. And he gives Mullah Barzani power that Mullah Barzani would have never gotten had it not been for Qasim. It was really a special opportunity for Barzani. Nevertheless, Barzani himself has to deal with his own calculations. He is coming to a Kurdish environment where you have all traditional forces that are aligned with the state, and in this case with Qasim. He has vendettas with them. It's an arena where he's trying to settle scores with them. Okay, so that's one dimension that's important. Also, he has his own vision. You mentioned the question of autonomy. The vision of autonomy grows actually with time as he gets more estranged from Qasim. So it's a dynamic process. Of course, he's always had some nationalist strand to him, but there's also other calculations that he has. This is not a solely ideological figure here. This is a very pragmatic politician as well. So initially there was this impression that the relationship will be great. I mean, Mustafa Barzani used to always pledge allegiance to Qasim. He felt, maybe even a sense of gratitude to him. This was the first leader that really reached out to him and tried to incorporate him into the running formula. But also he thought that he was going to be his strong man in Kurdistan, and that he was going to be put in charge. That's not Qasim's MO. So there are different stories about how things got sour. Jalal Talibani, for example, in his memoirs, he has, and of course, he becomes a competitor with the Barzani faction, but in initial days he was in their party, and I think he doesn't have much reason to lie about this. He attributes the difficulties to visit to the hospital after the assassination attempt on Qasim's life, where Mullah Mustafa Barzani and Qasim, things got tense over local conflicts in Kurdistan with some Kurdish elites that were tied to Qasim, and Barzani was very upset at the fact that these elites were still connected to Qasim, and Qasim got very incensed that Barzani would even interfere in who he decides to connect with or not, and he wanted an end to the local conflict there. He got very upset when Barzani did not end that conflict, and then there a series of moves on the part of Barzani showed too much independence for Qasim's liking. And it led eventually to him authorizing the bombardment of Barzani's positions. So this is the central state coming in and saying, you might think that you're a great regional leader, and yes, you're prominent within a major national minority in the country, but don't think that you're bigger than the state. That's basically the signal that Qasim was sending to him. What it did was it drove Barzani into a greater search for basically a break with the central government.
Kurdish armed struggle and the Kurdish national movement, it became and remains through the present day used by various regional and world powers to advance their own particular interests. And in 1964, Israel began to provide direct military aid and support to Iraqi Kurds, and they'd provided indirect funding through Iran since 1961. You write, quote, "As far as the Israeli regime was concerned, support for the Ailul Revolution was an extension of the periphery doctrine formulated by David Ben-Gurion. That entailed forming an anti-Arab front coordinated by the State of Israel, which would include Turkey in the north, Ethiopia in the south, and Iran in the east. As part of this vision, ethnic and religious minorities would also be used to destabilize Arab states. Iraqi Kurds were the most numerous of these minorities, and Barzani was the most powerful of their leaders." What were Israel and the Kurds' rationales for this alliance? And then, zooming out maybe a little from this particular moment we're discussing, what were the consequences of the Kurdish-Israeli alliance and also of just this broader and long-term instrumentalization of Kurdish national politics for and by so many geopolitical interests? And what were the impacts of that on the Kurdish struggle and the broader project of Arab nationalism and Arab anti-imperialism that we've dedicated this series to analyzing?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, we have to go back to the basics and remember, Kurds did not get a state out of Sykes-Picot. Let's remember that, and out of the peace settlement that came after World War I, and that's the root cause of their problems in Iraq, the problems in Turkey, the problems to a lesser extent in Syria and Iran, which are slightly different kind of formulations. But certainly in Iraq and Turkey, we have this situation going on. And you have the rise of a Kurdish nationalism that is calling for some kind of a pan-Kurdish geographic entity that would have state sovereignty that includes Kurdish majority territories in Iraq and Syria and Turkey and Iran. So this is like a historic fact. It's a latecomer into the nationalism game, but it nevertheless is an important new component in it. By the time we get to the Israeli state, it had inherited a history of central planning around what to do with the territories surrounding Palestine. Already, by the way, the Jewish Agency was conducting explorations around the surrounding region, and that was basically the formal body that was carrying out colonization in Palestine. And the Zionist movement as a whole was cultivating relationships, through different organs, including intelligence organs, with both Arab and non-Arab leaders. Their main idea was, if you were to have the emergence of a Jewish state in Palestine, then naturally it's going to be surrounded by countries that disapprove of that emergence. At least their populations will. The majority populations will. Certainly if they're of Arab ethnic background, because they'll feel some form of ethnic affiliation with the Palestinians, and they'll also see this, in the case of many of them, they'll see this as part of their territory, especially Arab nationalists. This for them is Arab territory that's lost. So the Israeli thinking was, you need to depend on non-Arabs in the Middle East to cultivate relationships with them. On the state level, that essentially meant Turkey and Iran. These are independent states that they could carry out relationships with. And when it came to the parts of East Africa that are closer to this region, especially in the Horn of Africa, you'd want to have a relationship with Ethiopia, for example, because it's, again, predominantly non-Arab country that you could establish relations with. So on the state structure, these are the available options. But then you also have non-state actors that are ethnic minorities within existing Arab states. And the peripheries doctrine built on this tradition of Zionist outreach to such communities, and it was basically a formalization of it in the 1950s. The idea here was, if the Arab countries are going to be hostile to this settler colonial presence, then it would be very useful to embroil them in internal conflicts, civil wars in particular. This explains the interest in supporting Kurds in Iraq, for example, and supporting Maronites in Lebanon, folks in southern Sudan.
Or even Druze within the state of Israel.
Yeah, but that's a different calculation.
Right.
That has to do with internal calculations. But yes, you're right. I mean, this idea of minorities, Druze and Bedouin, Arabs within the state of Israel, of course. And of course, they've always been trying to create some kind of Christian policy, but it hasn't worked so far. They weren't able to sectarianize Palestinian society enough to achieve that. But that doesn't mean that they don't try that, certainly in 1948 areas. In any case, the difficulty with the periphery doctrine is that it leads to civil wars. That's the basic logic of it. However, at the same time, when you think about it, all of these have legitimate national and ethnic demands. These are not areas that don't have real causes. And it's very important for us to emphasize this here on this podcast, because it's a progressive podcast. And it is not a chauvinist podcast. It is not a podcast that is just concerned with, favoring Arab nationality over any other. This is a universalist podcast, an internationalist one. So let's always remember that there are genuine grievances and national questions in each one of these zones. Well, I mean, in the case of the Maronites in Lebanon, is that's the only one where there's no national question. That's a sectarian dimension. But in the case of the Kurds, in the case of the Southern Sudan, there are important causes there. Okay, they have their limits too, and the limits come from potentially the nature of leaderships that are involved in them, political programs that are involved in them, and they have also their evolving characters, and they have also different lines. There are more progressive lines, there are more conservative lines. These are living and real national questions and struggles. Certainly that was the case in the Kurdish arena. So the difficulty in this, when it comes to causes of this kind, national causes, is that in order for a national struggle to succeed in this world, there has to be some external support for it. Certainly, when it's a national struggle that could entail a secession from a state that is recognized by the international community and has membership in the UN and so on, which is basically all of these states, the British and the French established in the Middle East. They end up becoming sovereign nations with their different agendas, and also with that very typical state obsession and concern, which is sovereignty and preservation of boundaries. And that concern becomes augmented by the fact that these states gained their independence through a process of very difficult struggle, and through emphasizing national unity and the sovereignty of their borders. And this is not even to start getting into the big elephant in the room most of the time, which is national resources. In the case of Iraq, there are important oil fields that come into the equation. There are water repercussions. The two great rivers that flow into Iraq, the Tigris and the Euphrates, flow through territories that are ethnic Kurdish in their character and the demographic character. So there's many different aspects to this structurally, and what that means is that these struggles, these national questions, can get instrumentalized as well by global powers who give promises of support and might even give weapons and money. But then what do when push comes to shove? They're not going to disturb the international order by creating a new state. So this is the dilemma that was faced by a movement like that of the Kurdish nationalist movement. Now, in Iraq, the Kurdish nationalist movement actually had a horizon that was very attainable of some form of self-rule. And we see Qasim hinting at that when he brought Barzani back. And remember, Qasim is not hostile to Kurds.
He's of Kurdish descent.
He's of part Kurdish descent. His mother was Kurdish. So she's from a Kurdish minority even. She's Shia Kurdish. So it's an interesting background that he has. But again, like, he represents this mosaic of Iraqi society in his own identity. What he was, though, although he was not anti-Kurdish, he was an Iraqiist in many ways, an Iraqi nationalist. So what that meant was that he insisted on this notion of Arab-Kurdish fraternity. I think he really believed in it. Everybody's an Iraqi citizen. He wants to promote that. He wants good relations between the central state and the prominent leaderships in Kurdistan. However, while being open to having Kurdish national rights develop, he was not willing to go as fast as Barzani wanted him to go. Barzani thought that, okay, I'm going to be coming back, and Qasim somehow is going to be giving me like full control over some self-governance arrangement, and I'll be the top person in that structure. That's not what Qasim was going to do. He counterbalanced him with the Zibaris, for example. That's a tribal coalition that is very opposed to the Barzanis historically. Other tribal coalitions were also involved in this counterbalancing act. What that did, though, was it led Barzani to believe that if he were to act on the many offers that were being given to him by geopolitical powers, including the State of Israel and including Iran, which is bordering Iraq, more importantly for him, that he could actually get enough military strength to be able to carry out a strong enough, revolutionary movement that would lead, at the bare minimum, to strong concessions on the self-governance front, if not complete independence. And this is where he starts getting these agreements with different characters, including different Western powers. He's cultivating all sorts of relationships. By entering into the Iranian arena this way, this becomes a really dangerous game, because the Kurds then get instrumentalized, Iraqi Kurds get instrumentalized by Iran. Whenever its relations are bad with Iraq, it activates revolts there, Kurdish revolts there, and then whenever the relationships were good, it threw them under the bus. And that became a pattern for the next while, certainly under the Shah, and certainly during the Khomeini's revolutionary period in the 1980s.
And it also sort of requires Iraqi Kurds to throw their Iranian compatriots under the bus.
Yes, because that's the complicating factor. I mean, similarly, Hafiz al-Assad, he instrumentalizes Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the Kurdish movement in Turkey. And he hosts Abdullah Öcalan, and he brings him to builds him bases and so on. But there's one rule there: don't encourage Kurdish nationalism in Syria. Your job is to cause trouble for the Turks. It's not to encourage Kurdish nationalism in Syria. All of this is not to take away, Daniel, because sometimes those that are not sympathetic to the Kurdish movement, and I'm not one of them. I recognize national movements, certainly when they've had a long history behind them, like this one. This is not to say that there's that it's not legitimate or that it's not a serious and important movement, but it is to say that imperial powers and regional powers that are trying to achieve their own Machiavellian agendas often use legitimate causes like this to their own ends.
I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that the sort of characters who say that the Kurdish national movement is illegitimate because of its entanglements with imperial power are the same people who say that Assad is great because the U.S. doesn't like him.
Yes, and these are the same people that also don't ask the immediate question of why is it that people are driven to alliances with imperial powers? If you had just formulas within our own societies that did actually adequately recognize national rights, which, by the way, Iraq came close to that. It was the closest country in the whole region, actually, to recognizing Iraqi Kurdish national rights. But that came after a long journey. But it's a country that was most amenable historically to that, and that's easily forgotten today, given some of the horrors that took place in Iraq later on, especially the Halabja massacres in the 1980s. But there were significant moments in Iraqi history where you had Arab and Kurdish relations that were functioning. It's not to be dismissed easily, this history.
I'm Naomi Klein, and you're listening to The Dig, my go-to podcast for the most thoughtful, in-depth conversation on the left. It's an incredible place to be exposed to new ideas and new writing. And if you can, please become a sustaining supporter at Patreon.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Towers of Ivory and Steel, How Israeli Universities Deny Palestinian Freedom by Maya Wind, with an afterword by Robin D.G. Kelly, and a foreword by Nadia Abu-Alhaj. Israeli universities have long enjoyed a reputation as liberal bastions of freedom and democracy, drawing on extensive research and making Hebrew sources internationally accessible. Maya Wind shatters this myth and documents how Israeli universities are directly complicit in the violation of Palestinian rights. Academic disciplines, degree programs, campus infrastructure, and research laboratories all service Israeli occupation and apartheid, while universities violate Palestinians' right to education, stifle critical scholarship, and violently repress student dissent. Towers of Ivory and Steel is a powerful expose of Israeli academia's ongoing and active complicity in Israel's settler colonial project. Out now from Verso Books. Ba'athi and nationalist officers led the coup that overthrew Qasim, the so-called Ramadan Revolution, in February 1963. Qasim was killed after surrendering, even as armed communist-led resistance persisted, particularly in poor Shia neighborhoods of Baghdad. And ultimately, a large number of communists were killed in battle. And then came an absolutely brutal wave of anti-communist repression, including widespread killing and torture. Why did this coup take off and succeed? And then what accounts for such spectacular brutality on the part of the Ba'ath?
Well, let's remember two things. One, and this is something that Munif Razzaz emphasizes in his discussion. He's a member of the National Command of the Ba'ath, and he discusses the Ba'athist experiment. I referred to him earlier in this episode. He's very keen, and I agree with him, on making a distinction between the Ba'athist officers that emerged in this period in both Syria and Iraq and the Ba'ath Party. And what we're seeing here is the Ba'athist officers are gaining in prominence. And they make their coups without even informing the Ba'ath Party. So what's often referred to as a Ba'ath coup was done without prior authorization from the Ba'ath national leadership. In the Ba'ath structure, there is something called the Qiyada Qawmi. It should be, and that's on the pan-Arab level. Something as serious as a coup should be run by it. But what we were seeing in both Iraq and Syria at the time is that these military formations are making decisions within each of their local spheres, Iraq and Syria, without going back to the national leadership, and which means without going back to the party proper. So that is fact number one. Issue number two that we have to think about in relation to this party is its officers and cadres had suffered immensely on the hands of the communists in earlier years. Especially during the Mosul events, there was such a great deal of repression that happened. There was a lot of killing that took place. And this is not to justify anybody's violence, but in a way, and this is something that I always have to remind some of my communist friends about, Iraqi communist friends about, is that communists kind of started it first, by being overzealous. I'm not saying that they didn't have, a serious challenge in the form of the Shawaf revolt, for example, in Mosul, or that they had no right to defend the regime that they felt most affiliated with, which is the Abdel Qasim regime, or that they didn't have a serious beef with the Ba'ath. But in those years when they had the upper hand, they were not exactly gentle and merciful with the Ba'athist cadres. The Ba'athists were really affected, and had it not been for Qasim, they could have been eradicated potentially. We don't know. I mean, you had all these communist committees that were persecuting. So the Ba'ath had, therefore, a mentality of revenge. And once you spill blood in these situations, it becomes difficult to deal with it. Now, you mentioned the fact that Shia neighborhoods had put up, resistance. I should note here that, and here, I'm also in complete concord with Hanna Batatu. It's important to not just stop at the sectarian description.
The neighborhoods were Shia, but many of the communist cadre fighting in those neighborhoods were from a variety of different backgrounds.
But not just that. The neighborhoods were Shia, but they were also, what was more important about them being Shia neighborhoods is that they were Shia working class neighborhoods, where the communists were strong. And the reason why we have to be careful around telling a sectarian story, at this stage, the vast majority of the national committee that was leading the Ba'ath were Shia in background. This was not a Sunni party yet. This is where people get, the sectarian designations become a bit annoying for a historian, because it's the same in Syria. They'll tell you, well, the Baathists were Alawis. Well, which Baathists are we talking about? Which period and which, you know what I mean? It's a very tricky, and unfortunately, American imperialism helped that discourse in Orientalism, because when they invaded Iraq later on, they turned everything into a purely sectarian calculation. So now, we only think of it as Shia, Sunni, Kurdish. In the past, there were so many different dimensions, and I think you put it very nicely in the past when you used to say that these different identities are mediated. Class identities get mediated through these different identities, and that's fine. But it's important to note here the class dimension as well as other political dimensions, including ideology as well. And in this case, we have an ideological struggle going on. But also we have blood from the past. We have people that had to live underground, people that were put under trial, people that had lost comrades. They want revenge. And also, we do have people who are just kidders that were not disciplined, that were quite random, and we see this in particular, with the rise of the National Guard that the Baathists form, which becomes one of the nastiest organizations and most repressive organizations. They carry out this coup. They establish this National Guard. They go after, communists and everybody else who they think is not good. They start setting up checkpoints. They start interrogating people. They start torturing people. So sometimes the lack of discipline, the lack of ideological training, the lack of grounding, the lack of foresightedness. If we were to look at modern Arab history, one of the worst episodes in it, from a political and ideological standpoint, was the conflict between the Ba'ath and the communists in Iraq in this period. It had so many damaging repercussions on a pan-Arab scale, by the way. A lot of this did not need to happen in the way it did. A lot of the excess did not need to happen. But it's easier said in hindsight, of course, Daniel. And many Baathists and communists later on, regret that and feel sorry about it. But the owl of Minerva only flies after the onset of dusk, as our old friend Hegel used to say.
Did the coup basically prove the communists to be correct that Qasim indeed needed the Communist Party to maintain his power? And more specifically, in terms of those debates within the Communist Party, did the coup and the resulting anti-communist bloodbath, did it prove the communist left to be correct in its argument that the party should have mounted a revolution against Qasim when they had the power to do so once he had turned on the party? What could the communists have done differently? And also, what could others, including Qasim, have done differently?
I honestly don't know. Let's say he did depend on the communists, and he just aggrandized them completely. Let's say he did not allow for counterbalancing them and did not shut down some of their party organs. Maybe they could have done a coup against him. In fact, we know that they were debating the potential of that, yeah? Like a communist seizure of power could have happened. That's not necessarily what Qasim would have wanted. Had he done other moves to stop the Baathists, let's say, had he cracked down completely, gone too far in cracking down, it would have disturbed some of the balance of power he was trying to maintain in the army, and again, a situation where the army has been injected with a heavy ideological dose. So something was happening towards the end of Qasim's reign where his military game was not that perfect. His calculation of where the military stood. I mean, really, that particular coup was not a very popular coup. It was a military move. It actually depended a lot on the Air Force initially. Okay, so was he alert enough on that level? Did he think through or calculate loyalties correctly at that level? Obviously not. Okay, so and then when it comes to certain decisions that could have been made during the time of the coup. For example, during the coup, Qasim decided on a defensive strategy. He took shelter in the Ministry of Defense, and basically it was heavily fortified. He had divisions loyal to him heavily armed, and he just sat there and waited for an invasion, and there was heavy fighting that took place. Is that the smartest thing to do? I don't know. Some of his aides were advocating going on the offensive, mobilizing the whole army, and he was a popular figure, Daniel. He had different courses of action open to him. Maybe he expected that things wouldn't go so bad with Arif. He had an old relationship. When you have these old relationships, in a way, he did not kill Arif, for example. So did he expect that Arif would have treated him with greater leniency? Maybe put him in exile or something? We know that he communicated a request of that sort to him. Instead, Arif, took a different path and ended up executing him. So we don't know, but I can say very definitely that it is clear that Qasim had made a set of mistakes within the military at this stage, but also certain policies he did went too far. Like the conflict with Nasser went too far. That could have been handled differently. It would have saved him a lot of problems. The idea that you could set up like an alternative to Nasser in the region was just like a bit nonsensical, to be honest with you. Like it was above his capacity at this stage, and it was not necessary. And he did not have also the ideological vehicle to stop it, because to promote it, because Nasser had pan-Arabism. What did Qasim have regionally? Would he have promoted like Iraqi nationalism regionally? That doesn't work. Yes, he utilized the Palestinian cause by training some Palestinian officers. He claimed to be pursuing Arab unity by, making a bid on Kuwait. But these moves were not enough to create an alternative, a genuine alternative center ideologically and politically. They caused him only trouble at home. So could he have avoided that? Yes. Did he have to go into war with the Kurds? I mean, Barzani made mistakes, in that front. There's no doubt about it. It's clear that also Qasim made serious mistakes. He didn't need to immediately go and bombard Barzani's positions. I mean, it's again, we can understand the actions of both of these characters, but there were alternative courses of action. But in history, we're often confronted, with this question of what if. And I know people confront that in their personal lives as well as when they're dealing with bigger questions like this. And often, we should stick to that question is only relevant if it can help us understand alternative potentialities. But to dwell on it is not helpful beyond that. Because at the end of the day, we're stuck with what did happen, not with what could have been happened and what mistakes could have been averted.
Let's turn back to Syria, where a March 1963 coup brought the Ba'ath Party to power. And this period between the secessionist coup and the Ba'athi coup witnessed coup attempts and then Nasserist efforts to rejoin the UAR amid all these intense attacks from Nasser, who called for the overthrow of what he condemned as reactionary regimes, not only in Damascus, but also in Baghdad, Riyadh, and Amman. And then there were intense splits within the Ba'ath Party, including a huge split between the factions led by Akram al-Harwani and factions led by Michel Aflaq and Saladin al-Bitar. And listeners should recall that the unification of those two factions in 1952, that was a key moment in making the Ba'ath Party the force in Syrian politics that it became. So how did this March 1963 Ba'athist coup in Syria take shape? And who were the Syrian Ba'athists? Because as we've discussed, the Ba'ath Party comes to mean so many different things at so many different times in so many different places and has so many different rival factions. What sort of Syrian Ba'athists seized power in 1963 in Syria?
Let's start by recalling the military committee that was formed in 1959 in the context of the United Arab Republic. We mentioned the circumstances, the overall circumstances surrounding the formation of the committee. But we should note that its membership was basically comprised of Ba'athists in the army, and these included characters that were to become very important later on. Characters like Salah Jadid. Salah Jadid was very influential. He was stationed in Egypt at the time. He was presented himself as somebody who was keen on protecting the UAR and its unity. So we have somebody here that is also very different in terms of his background from the traditional political Ba'ath. Is a military person through and through. And again, he comes from the countryside, not from Damascus, and he comes from Alawi background, like some of his other comrades in the military committee. Nevertheless, in initial years, he was part of this party, but his relationships with the central leadership were, to say the least, distant. Same goes for other comrades of his, like Hafiz al-Assad. They come from a different generation, by the way. These were people who were born in the 1930s, not like Salahuddin Bitar and Salahuddin Bitar and Michel Aflaq were already established teachers and important intellectuals in the 1930s when these guys were kids. So there is this generational gap. And essentially, there was the beginnings of a potential power struggle with what used to often be referred to in Ba'athist circles as the Asatid al-Kibar, the three big ustaz. Ustaz means teacher or like Mr. or something, it's a nice honorific kind of title. There's three figures that were very important in the history of the Ba'ath, Akram al-Hurani and Michel Aflaq and Salahuddin al-Bitar. So these people had issues with them, Now, there was an element of ambition as well. These were politically ambitious people, and their political ambitions meant that they were willing to do action in the army. So while stationed in Egypt, you have this crew that includes people like Salah Jadid, includes people like Hafiz al-Assad, includes people like Salim Imran. These come together and they say, you know what? The national leadership made a mistake by dissolving the party in 1959. We're blaming the big three for that. We're going to resurrect the party. And they do that in 1960. But they're claiming to be resurrecting the party to improve relations and carry out reform within the UAR from within. That's at least a claim. Okay? Some people question the veracity of their intentions or the truthfulness of it, but that's a claim. It may well be true. But what happens next, of course, as we know, is that you end up with a coup. They're not too keen on the secessionist outcome of that coup. And their struggle with the national leadership deepens as this secessionism takes place. You have initially Ba'ath political figures giving cover. Salah ad-Din Bittar initially, he gives cover to the coup that was carried out by Abdel Nahlawi and the Damascene officers against the unity. So, it causes issues. Muhammad Imran, Salah Jadid, and Hafiz al-Assad, these kind of characters that were to become very central, they're actually sitting around, they're planning what to do next in relation to the Qudsi government. The big factor that galvanizes them into action is actually what happens in Iraq just a couple of weeks earlier. The end of February, we have the Ba'athist take control essentially in Iraq through a limited army action. It didn't take much orchestration. It wasn't even a very elaborate army action. The Air Force went, it bombed an airfield, then a couple of units got mobilized, they marched on the capital, took over the sensitive main areas, including the radio station and so on, made false proclamations about the fall of the regime, and then besieged the president in the Ministry of Defense, fought really hard for the Ministry of Defense, managed to take it over, got the president to surrender, not the president, sorry, the premier to surrender, and eventually we have a situation where Abdel Qasim is executed and this regime is over. So these people in the military committee of the Ba'ath Party, they're like, we could do that. And some had been had already some of the characters had already tried to do a failed coup like the previous year. So including Hafiz al-Assad himself. So it's not like they weren't having long-standing issues with the existing government. So the March 8th coup in Syria cannot be detached from its broader Ba'athist context and especially from its Iraqi context.
And is the civilian Ba'ath leadership involved in the Syrian 1963 Ba'ath coup, or is it entirely the military committee?
The political leadership, and this becomes a matter of contention. According to Munif Razzaz, they were not told about the coup. They did not authorize it, and it came as a surprise. But then he says, look, we gave it our blessing because of what he considers to be miscalculation on the part of the leadership. Munif Razzaz considered, and a lot of the old Baathists later on in their auto-critique considered that they made a mistake, and that the national leadership made a mistake because it thought that it can approve of this coup and then it can actually form a Ba'athist government, which is what happened, but without establishing clear guidelines for what is the relationship going to look like between the civilian wing of the party in government and the military side of the party that carried out the coup. So he says that there should have been a very clear understanding on the relationship between the two. because in his view, the military committee was acting independently of the party. These were people that had Ba'athist backgrounds and that were speaking in the name of the Ba'ath, but they were not the Ba'ath. They were not going back to the Ba'ath party when they were making decisions. So he was saying, look, what should have happened was there should have been a regulation of the relationship. And that's something that a lot of Baathists said later on in hindsight. From the very beginning, they should have said, we're not going to participate in government if we don't have full control over the government. What is your role? Your role is to ensure, for example, Ba'ath ascendancy in the military, and we'll take care of the civilian side. That could have been one option. Another option could have been, let's have two parties, but affiliated ones. Or let's have two wings. Organizationally, there could have been many formulas. But to the outside world, everybody was speaking about Ba'athist rule in Syria. But the funny thing about what was happening was this was all Ba'athist rule without Ba'athists. Because the real Ba'ath, its official leadership, its traditional leaders, and many of its civilian cadres were not the ones really in power. It was an inner circle of Ba'athist military officers.
And as we'll talk about near the end of this episode, this issue with the increasing autonomy of the Ba'ath military committee and Ba'athist military officers from the Ba'ath party's political party's civilian leadership, it comes to a head in a really nasty way in 1966 and really again in 1970. After the 1963 coup that overthrew Qasim in Iraq, it was Qasim's one-time coup accomplice and then later rival and enemy Arif who took his place as leader of a regime that was made up with a rather diverse and ultimately very conflictual anti-Qasim coalition. And so less than a year after Arif and the Ba'ath cooperated in the coup to overthrow Qasim, Arif and his allies purged Ba'athists in yet another coup. So I'm going to make an attempt at summarizing this brief period separating the February and November Iraqi coups of 1963. There were pushes to unify Syria, Egypt, and Iraq, but they all fell apart quickly. There was growing conflict between various factions of the Ba'ath, conflicts that involved factions both within and between the Syrian and Iraqi Ba'ath, including an Iraqi so-called left Ba'athi faction that, with the Syrian Ba'ath military committee's support, purged the Iraqi party of Michel Aflaq's followers. There was also conflict between a Ba'ath-controlled militia called the National Guard and top Iraqi military officers. There were conflicts between Ba'athists and Nasserists and members of the movement of Arab nationalists. There was pressure also from the Soviet Union around the Ba'athi slaughter of Iraqi communists. How did all these conflicts and contradictions that pervaded the regime that came to power in February 1963, and I'm sure other conflicts and contradictions that I failed to mention, how did that all lead to that November 1963 coup against the Ba'ath?
First of all, Daniel, Abdel Arif was not a Ba'athist. And this is important to note. He was in coalition with the Ba'ath, or he had allied with the Ba'ath in his quest to overthrow Qasim. But Abdel Arif was closer to a Nasserist conception of things. He was very, at this stage, he was very taken by the image of Gamal Abdel Nasser and his policies. And however, he was willing to work with the Ba'ath. And initially, during his coup, the Ba'ath played an important, very important role in bringing him to power, which meant that in the initial period, the Ba'ath was the dominant force in Iraq after the overthrow of Qasim. But the Ba'ath leadership in Iraq was basically confronted with a challenge, which is that their power in the army was limited. They had officers in the army, but they were spread a bit thin. Their solution to this, and we're talking here about local leaderships that were really running the show, not the Ba'ath National Command, which operated on the pan-Arab level. We're talking here about people like Ali Saleh al-Sadi, who was really pushing for a development of a strong alternative power base for the Ba'ath. And their method of doing that was to establish a National Guard, the National Guard committees. The National Guard became essentially a parallel structure to the army. And that force, which numbered in the thousands, was not particularly disciplined. Some of its practices had to do with taking revenge against the communists who had previously massacred a lot of Baathists and killed them and tortured them in earlier years. So now they felt they needed to do the same to their foes. So instead of thinking about the political future of the country, they were engaging in a purge of the communists and essentially the politics of vendetta. But also, some of these members had nothing to do with the Ba'ath altogether. Some of them were just, local thuggish types that were looking for personal gain, essentially. And they were not particularly ideologically disciplined. So that caused resentments within the army. And it also caused Abdel Arif to fear the potential of Ba'ath action against him. So eventually, structurally, this was an unsustainable position. And it was bound to lead to a serious contradiction. And Abdel Arif did, as far as he was concerned, what he needed to do by essentially removing the Ba'ath from power by moving against them before they could move against him. Was it inevitable? Could the Ba'ath moderated its policies? Could it have taken other steps? As we've mentioned in so many different prior episodes, there were always alternatives. And it's easy to judge these things in hindsight. But yes, I believe that it could have been done differently. The Ba'ath leadership at the time was beginning to feel that it was losing control over its own party. And I'm talking here about the national leadership. That there was a mercurial tendency that was affecting the party rather than a steady, long-term, one that was based on the visions and principles of the party. And this came as a result of the increasing entry of a militarizing trend into the party. We'll talk about this more when it comes to Syria as well.
And Michel Aflaq, he disapproved of the Ba'athi reign of terror against communists in the wake of the coup.
Yes, there were the national leadership in general in the Ba'ath party, although they were vehemently opposed and talked very bitterly about communist action against them earlier, including different massacres and the different attacks. Especially the Mosul episode played a big role in shaping those resentments, but also like the hunting down of Baathists in Baghdad and elsewhere during the time of the ascendancy of the Communist Party under Qasim. But at the same time, they thought that this was too extreme, that it should not be as bloody as it was, and they were right.
After Abdul Salam Arif died in a 1966 plane crash, his brother Abdul Rahman Arif took power. What sort of regime under both Arif brothers did this second coup of November 1963 put in place? This was, to clarify for listeners, a regime that would last until the next Ba'ath coup in 1968. Union with Nasser's Egypt was once again on the agenda as the government nationalized major industries and as Egypt's sole political party, the Arab Socialist Union, merged with a similar party set up in Iraq. But once again, union did not happen. Indeed, Nasserists would increasingly turn against the Iraqi regime. Abid, what should listeners understand about this regime that dominated Iraq under both Arif brothers in the years ahead of the 1968 Ba'ath coup that would consolidate long-term Ba'ath hegemony?
Let's start first with the Nasserist bit. As I mentioned, this initially under Abdel Salam Arif, and both under Abdel Salam and Abdul Rahman, they both felt close to the Nasserist ideal. And in the case of Abdel Salam, he tried early on to achieve unity with Egypt. That became the basis of his coalition after he overthrew the Baathists, actually. Because the remaining partners that he had from the party world were the movement of Arab nationalists that were very committed to the idea of establishing unity with Egypt, of course, and that saw themselves as essentially Nasser's voluntary arm in the region. This was the basis of his coalition with them in many ways, and he did want to undertake unity with Egypt. But there were problems. The main problem and the biggest one was that Nasser was not interested. He was worried of repeating mistakes that had happened during the time of the unity with Syria. He was worried that Iraq was far from Egypt, even further away from Syria. Logistically, it would have been very difficult to send troops there, to conduct all sorts of things there. You'd have to rely on air transport. Unlike Syria, which has a Mediterranean shore and is close to Egypt, there were all sorts of logistical hurdles you needed to think of. The countries that were bordering Iraq and Egypt and separating them from each other were hostile to Nasser and his government. So there were difficulties with this, and I believe that Nasser was fairly confident that the situation in Iraq internally would have brought him a lot of headaches. So this was something that meant that although there was a political will on the part of Arif to conduct unity negotiations in very good faith and to achieve unity, on the Nasserist side there was less enthusiasm. And then once you remove this unity agenda, which was the main goal in many ways, then the internal contradictions start playing. And of course, he had his own problems with the Al-Qawmiyin al-Arab, with the Arab nationalists, with the movement of Arab nationalists. Eventually, he falls out with them as well. And that leads then to, the continuation of a new base of power, which relies on kinship networks, ensuring that the state is and the army are well staffed with these networks. This becomes a new power base that Arif relies on. He comes from a powerful big tribe, the Jumayla. So he has Jumailis in different positions, especially in the army, and this becomes like part of the way of conducting rule in the country.
The Iraqi Communist Party had as we've discussed, suffered absolutely brutal, devastating, shattering repression under the Ba'ath after that first 1963 coup. Under the Arif brothers, but Hannah Batatu recounts this real roller coaster of an experience for the communists in terms of their orientation toward the Arifs and also towards Nasser. And that involved major differences between the Communist Leadership Committee abroad, the Leadership Committee on the ground in Iraq, and by 1967, there was even a formal split with an ultra-left, Maoist-inspired Iraqi Communist Party Central Command calling for armed guerrilla struggle. Abed, how would you summarize the Iraqi communists' various positions in politics and just their actual position in Iraqi politics after 1963?
Well, I mean, you have here a party that was trying to recover from a very serious hit, early on during the initial onset of the regime of Abdel Salam Arif. Of course, there was the hit that was that the communists took on the hands of the Baathists. But then there was a period of greater openness towards them after Arif got rid of the Baathists. So this counter coup that he launched against the Baath, or whatever we want to call it, his removal of the Baath from positions of power and influence, meant that there was an opportunity to relax the atmosphere. So this led to, obviously, a series of debates and different tendencies to emerge within a party like the Communist Party, because they had taken big hits. So many of the party members that you could call were more on the realist side of things were feeling that it's good to keep some channels with the governing authorities rather than carry out any form of major insurgency against them or any sort of armed struggle. The feeling was that essentially they didn't have the base to do that. Whereas the more ultra factions that you refer to, especially ones that were now influenced by Maoist ideas of guerrilla warfare, and particularly relying on the countryside and the peasantry, were seeing some form of horizon for change through adopting new strategies, new tactics. Of course, these things also cannot be viewed in isolation of Sino-Soviet split dynamics as well, which affected all communist parties. And in the 60s, every communist party had to experience this, including the Communist Party of Iraq. There was no doubt that you had people in every communist party in the world that saw a great deal of hope and inspiration in China. And there were others that were still very loyal to the Soviet Union. In the Arab region and in Iraq, of course, the Soviet direction was the strongest within communist parties for many different reasons. But that does not mean that you did not have the development and the growth of Maoist ideas. You have also a third issue that is at play, which is, of course, much of the Arif years internally are dominated by the war in Kurdistan, which, of course, did not start during the reign of the Arif brothers, but it started earlier with Abdel Qasim. But by now it had developed significantly, and especially under Abdeslam Arif's brother, who Abdurrahman Arif, who takes power after the airplane crash that was suffered by Abdeslam Arif. By the way, initially it used to be reported as a helicopter crash, but most theories now say it's a airplane crash. In any case, the reign of Abdurrahman Arif starts with an ill-fated major offensive against the forces of Mullah Barzani. And, he really makes a big mobilization, but it's difficult terrain. It's also terrain where Kurdish forces are fighting on their own territory that they know very well. And of course, they were supported at the time by both the Shah and the Israeli state. So, Israelis sometimes aggrandize their role. They say that they made the plans for that, and they all the defeat is part of the Israeli propaganda, defense propaganda globally. But definitely they did play a role in this for sure. And that meant that you had a setback for Arif. Again, this kind of illustrated the possibilities of defeating an organized army in difficult terrain in the countryside, and all of these factors also meant that there was a lot of soul searching going at this period in communist ranks. What is to be done was a big question for them. The other difficulty that they were facing is when it came to the government of Arif and the government of Nasser as well, which was the inspiration behind Arif's style of government. Many of the economic policies and much of the, let's say the general facade of government that was adopted by the Arab brothers was inspired by Egyptian forms of Arab socialism, and some of these policies were not necessarily seen as bad by the communists. They were not against land reform or its expansion. They were not against various different policies that were undertaken by Nasser and, of course, by the Arif brothers. But some of the policies also caused problems for the economy because they entailed a clash with the bourgeoisie that was not easy to carry out, and that did lead to things like capital flight. So, for example, the nationalization of banks and insurance companies. So it was a very complicated period to be a communist at. You were not definitely these were not governments in power that implemented a program that you fully agreed with, but at the same time they had the partial aspects of what you wanted to see in this world adopted. At the same time, at the end of the day, these were governments that were far more inclined towards an Arab nationalist agenda or a pan-Arabist agenda rather than a classical CP type of agenda.
Let's finish the episode, which will end on the eve of the 67 war. Let's end it in Syria. In February 1966, the Syrian Ba'ath Military Committee and allied forces that are often described as left-wing and neo-Ba'athist, they staged a coup against the party's old guard. Very familiar figures from this series that listeners have heard a lot about. People like Michel Aflaq and Salah al-Din al-Bitar. How did the 66 coup come about? And what should we make of this divide within the Syrian Ba'ath Party at this point? This military committee purportedly supporting the party's left wing and the civilian old guard being described as being on the right. And then lastly, how did the coup impact Ba'ath power dynamics on a regional level, specifically, once again, between the Iraq and Syrian branches?
So once again, we have to go back to the United Arab Republic to understand this episode. When the Ba'ath Party decided to agree with Nasser's directive that they're going to dissolve the party, and when Michel Aflaq did dissolve the party, you had some discontent within parts of the party, but also what you ended up having was a situation in which any reconstitution of the party in the future was going to have to take place in an atmosphere where a gap had now existed. So when you have a dissolution of a party, you cannot guarantee that the new party that will reemerge later will be the same. And that was part of the difficulty that was faced by the old leadership of the Ba'ath. The old Ba'ath had the three huge, big name figures, the three Asatideh, the three, big people, Salah al-Din al-Bitar, Michel Aflaq, of course, and of course, Akram Hourani. But then now you have like a new atmosphere where different leaderships are going to emerge without even knowledge of these big founding figures and without knowledge of very important other figures like, as we mentioned earlier, Munif al-Razzaz, who plays a big role, and he's removed by this coup, by the way, because he was the head of the National Committee at this stage. National Committee meaning the pan-Arab one. People like that had no clue that there were people now organizing in the name of the Ba'ath within the Syrian army, but that were not part of its traditional party structure or leadership and did not take directives from that leadership. And in particular, here we're talking about those members of the Syrian Air Force that were in Cairo during, that we've referred to earlier in this episode. The big character that played a huge role in galvanizing these officers together was a guy called Salah Jadid. Salah Jadid was a key player after the formation of this so-called military committee that we referred to earlier. And he had a very bumpy relationship with the national leadership of the Ba'ath, as well as with sectors of the Ba'ath in the army that he had initially worked with to overthrow the Qudsi government and to institute, the revolution of 1963. So you have here this military committee that's established, and they have good relations with each other. They serve together, and they also, in the case of at least two key members in that committee, with the military committee, you had people who came from the same region and the same sect, the Alawi sect, and who had worked together, which were Hafiz al-Assad and Salah Jadid. And now, at the same time, they need a figurehead to carry out a big move like the 1963 coup, and they find that figure in this very dynamic and well-regarded and well-liked, quite popular, officer, Amin al-Hafiz, who was at the time in semi-exile, working as a military attaché in Buenos Aires in the Syrian embassy there. So they bring him back, and essentially he becomes the president of the new republic after the coup. Initially it sounded like they're all working together, and that everything is fine. But then you start seeing differences surface between them, and these differences are very complicated. They're not an easy set of differences. Amin al-Hafiz develops a power base, but its power base is resting more on public outreach. He's presenting himself as a very popular leader, as a popular figure, in touch with the people, this and that. He focuses himself, on his public image. In the meantime, Salah Jadid starts working very quietly inside the military, and he's building a power base there inside it. And what he's doing, and this is the big shift that happens in the military internally at this time, he's making use of the purges that had happened against the Damascene officers earlier, and against other officers that were seen as being part of the regime of the secession, and that were seen as having committed the so-called crime of secession. So they're getting purged on the one hand, but at the same time, there's all these replacements and new recruitments that he's taking care of, for the most part, concentrated on people from his region and from his sect, which is why you end up, and I'm, and I think we have to be honest and very forthcoming about this in this conversation. It's a very sensitive one because it's talking about sect. But yes, this is how you end up with a predominantly large percentage of Alawis in the Syrian army. Now, here's the other thing that's happening. Aside from building a base through admission to the military academy and so on for people from his sect, he's also, working through a set of moves to isolate Hafiz in very smart ways. Amin al-Hafiz was essentially outplayed by him every step of the way. Like sometimes he'd nominate people who were close to Amin al-Hafiz to important positions, so as to create splits in the ranks of the coalition around Amin al-Hafiz. He was able to even attract people that had previously been attacking him and that were strongly in the Hafiz camp, and people who did not belong to his sect. He was able to build and all sorts of alliances with people, like Mustafa Tlas, for example, who was a Sunni officer and who used to attack Salah Jdid, and so he joins him. Emil al-Hafiz also commits a series of mistakes. He starts, inside the military committee, he wages a campaign accusing Salah Jdid and Hafiz al-Assad and the rest of that crew of being sectarian and of doing a sectarian takeover of the army. Now, in a secular party like the Ba'ath, that's based on the idea of Arab nationalism, not just Syrian nationalism, like Arab nationalism. They see it as vulgar to speak about sect or other backgrounds. It left a sour taste, even though it could generate some sympathy in certain circles, that discourse, but it left a sour taste. This is a party that had always had a significant number of minorities within it. We spoke about this before. Parties like this, radical parties of this sort, their message did not appeal to the petty bourgeoisie in the cities. And the cities, traditionally, the largest population in the cities, the two main trading cities and the biggest by far in Syria, Aleppo and Damascus, but also places like Homs. These are Sunni majority cities. The countryside, however, is very diverse. You have a very agrarian Druze population in the south, in the Hauran region. Alongside, of course, many others. There are, of course, it's still a Sunni majority in the countryside, but it's a very diverse countryside. And then you have the Alawi countryside in the Mediterranean, alongside the Mediterranean coast. And again, all of these areas are mixed. I hate to talk about them in these sectarian terms, and I actually think it's very problematic. If we were to have a future revival of an Arab progressive project, we need to find formulas to refer to sectarian dynamics without falling into the traps of just talking about them in that way. But anyways, the reality is that you have this party recruiting from these areas. The message appeals to these areas because if your message is land reform, for example, the people that will like this message are going to be people who come from agrarian backgrounds and underprivileged ones. Of course, there was an old traditional base of the party, which were the teachers and so on, but then you had another base of the party, which sociologically depended on those social classes. And that's why you had also lots of Alawis enter the party, as well as Druze and Christians and others. So in any case, for Emil Hafiz to come and launch accusations of sectarianism did not go down very well, and Salah Jdid was very careful to make use of all of these mistakes. Another problem that we had was, aside from the contradiction inside the military committee between Salah Jdid and Amin al-Hafiz, with of course Hafiz al-Assad carefully, building his power behind the scenes throughout as this was happening. And later on, he'll get rid of Salah Jdid himself, as we'll see later in this series. But in this period, the main conflict on the surface is Salah Jdid versus Amin al-Hafiz. Then you have another conflict going on, which has to do with the National Committee, and by that we mean the Pan-Arab Committee. And then you have the Syrian Qutri Committee, which means the Syrian committee, basically, the Syrian. Yeah, so the Ba'ath, because it did not believe in borders between Arab states, it referred to the nation as the Arab nation. So that's the National Committee was responsible for all Arab countries. But then it invented a word for, or didn't invent a word. The word was there, but for different Arab countries were called aqtar. So it meant they're subsections of the nation. They're just like geographic entities. So you had this Qutri committee, in which again the military committee was having fights over, and for a while it was outside the control of the National Committee. So So that was another issue to resolve, conflicts over the local Syrian Ba'ath Committee. Then you have the conflicts over the National Committee itself. And some of these emanate from this difficult situation in which the founding fathers want to retain control, even though they're living in a very different age and where there's new generations that have come through. So as we know from previous episodes, the most famous Ba'ath figure and the most important founder is Michel Aflaq, and then there's his close friend Salah ad-Din Bitar coming in essentially second. Yeah, Michel Aflaq from the very beginning was the Secretary General of the party, and he was basically the head of the National Committee. But he decides that he's gonna leave the leadership of that committee around that time, and that's when they bring in Munif al-Razzaz into the scene as the Secretary General that's gonna replace him. But he still wants to play a role from behind the scenes, and here we have like a problem emerging. Both him and Salah ad-Din Bitar want to play a role behind the scenes, but they're not officially on the National Committee. And in the meantime, then the leadership of the National Committee, which was recommended by them, the new leadership, Munif al-Razzaz is recommended by them. He was formerly the head of the local Jordanian committee and was a political prisoner in Jordan. He was a medical doctor, highly respected intellectual, author, and major figure in the party. And he came in under the impression that him and Aflaq were thinking along the same lines about what is to be done next. His plan was he wants to initiate good relations with these military officers because there was no way to get rid of them, while at the same time creating conditions where they cannot control civilian government and where they get basically pushed back into their barracks. And to do that, Munif al-Razzaz was trying to not escalate with them, because he felt that if you escalate, then they'll come and push back at you and destroy you. They've got the guns, you don't have the guns. As simple as that. That was his understanding of the balance of power. Aflaq and Bitar had a slightly different position. Aflaq wanted to expose the takeover of his party by these military figures. He was very bitter about it. He wanted to publish statements about it, even talk about the reasons behind his resignation and gratitude of these characters that came into the party that took it into a different direction. These were people that had, by the way, there was a major decline in party education under them. There were many problems. So he wants to essentially criminalize them and expose them. And then you have, on the other hand, Salah ad-Din Bitar, his close friend and associate, lifelong associate and closest friend, and again one of the two co-founders. He wants to take it to the next level, and he wants to clash with them directly, not just publish stuff about them. He wants to remove them, and he wants the National Committee to be the instrument of doing that. That causes tension between the National Committee under Razzaz and Aflaq and Bitar. So there's all of these different power bases that are developing at this time, and these are all Ba'athists, but they include different generations of the Ba'ath. There's the founding fathers, there's the people who come from a very early generation like Munif al-Razzaz. Then you have people who are coming from his military background. They're newcomers, but they're seen as hijacking the party for agendas that have nothing to do with the ideology of the party or with its original directions. If you want to complicate it further, the Salah Jadid faction, in its war with both the Amin al-Hafiz regime as well as the party leadership, the traditional party leadership and the National Committee, essentially uses left-wing ideology as its banner, So they're accusing these people of being essentially right-wing.
Do the so-called neo-Baathists, do they have a substantial ideological difference with the traditional Baathists that they overthrew, or is that more of a pretext to legitimate their power play?
So yes, there is a big and a big element of this was to use leftist slogans for internal power grabbing. There's no doubt about it. But also there's no doubt about the fact that under Salah Jdid and the group that he brings into power, he does bring in some leftist figures in the Ba'ath, and he does implement a project that entails some leftist economic policies, but also they're committing to a geopolitical policy that raises a more left-wing stance. And here, in particular, we're talking about Palestine and to some extent Yemen. So they're trying to show that they're to the left of Nasser. They essentially end up clashing with Nasser, and they want to show that they're more committed to anti-colonial armed revolts than he was. And this, as we shall see in subsequent episodes, gives an opening for the Palestinian revolution, because this is when Syria actually does allow for training and for facilitating the emergence of a Palestinian guerrilla warfare movement, especially under the direction of Fatah. So we have this dynamic appearing at this moment. But Nasser was very upset with this because he felt that the Syrian government, was launching this verbal assault on him, accusing him of cowardice, accusing him of not confronting Israel, accusing him of not confronting Arab reactionary regimes. He was trying to find a way, an exit out of the Yemen crisis and the clash with the Saudis. He was trying to find a way of not having a direct clash with the Israelis at a time when he's not ready for such a clash, and the Arab region as a whole is not ready for such a clash. But in the meantime, you had this Syrian government, which was very much pushing this line that we need a liberation war now. Why aren't we supporting Palestinian liberation right now? And this created serious problems for Nasser. So is that a traditional left position? I don't know if we can call that leftism or not. On the surface, it looks like a leftist position, but it's of course it has elements of it that might be described as ultra or adventurous potentially, at least when it came to the geopolitics. Were some people sincere about it that were involved with Salah Jdid? Yes, probably not him though. I think that some of the figures that were associated with him, people like Dr. Ibrahim Makhous, people like Dr. Nurdil Atasi, all of them, these are people that come into power. Yusuf Zayin, these are people that served with the National Liberation Front in Algeria. They had volunteered there as medical doctors. They had so they had a certain sympathy for the idea of developing a Palestinian capacity for liberation along the Algerian model. They were committed to third worldism. They were committed to all these causes. So it's a complicated. I think the answer to your question, the short answer is yes and no.
To close out, this episode chronicled the failure of the United Arab Republic in Syria and in Egypt, and then also the failure of Qasim and the Communist Party to achieve some sort of stable, hegemonic revolutionary regime in Iraq. And, of course, an increasingly splintered Ba'ath Party played a really important role in both countries. What should we make of this arc from 1958 through the early 1960s, of the rise and fall of these utopian revolutionary dreams that so defined this era of Arab political radicalism? Or maybe to put the question another way, how do you assess where these diverse Arab radicalisms that surged forth first during the Mandate era and then so intensely after the Nakba, where does this leave all these competing radical projects on the eve of the 67 war?
The first difficulty that all of these projects face is that the question of the state was not resolved in the region. On the nationalist end, all of these parties developed out of a desire to unify, at the very least, the former Ottoman territories that had an Arab majority in them, and almost all of them later on were more ambitious. They wanted a unified Arab world from the Gulf to the ocean. Their visions seemed to be realistic for a short while when you had the United Arab Republic established. The 1950s was a period in which big hopes were developing. Remember, these were countries that just gained independence. They were about to start their journeys. And there was this hope that they could unify, okay, and at the same time carry out different policies. In the case of these more radical parties, they wanted to see more social justice inclined policies, more greater redistribution. Some of them wanted to see, a more radical socialist policies. Others wanted to see social democracy. But regardless, the left on the whole dominated the political arena.
They all wanted to see the defeat of imperialism, Zionism, and Arab reaction.
Yes, and it's quite significant. I mean, if we look at the overall kind of picture, it was not just a dark picture, Daniel, from leftist perspective. In many ways, this was the golden age, despite all the setbacks of the Arab left, in the sense that you had the overthrow of a monarchical regime in Egypt and the removal of Egypt from the Western camp proper, its entry into non-alignment, and an ambitious set of policies that were redistributive in character, free education, heavily supported healthcare, expansion of healthcare provision, building of schools. There was so much, going on that did benefit people's lives directly, which is why even the biggest competitors with Nasser, the communists, liked that aspect of Nasserism, and they were fair in their assessments of it at the time. You had an expansion in the women's movement. We saw that also happen in Iraq. Iraq also exits the Western camp, enters into non-alignment, achieves nationalization projects, makes big strides towards taking control of its national resources, especially oil. It's supporting revolutionary movements in other parts of the Arab world in the same way that Egypt was. So these are important things that are happening. Syria does not end up entering into the Western orbit because of these, struggles. It does not enter the Baghdad Pact. These are the three most important Arab countries in the Mashriq. And you also have, I should note, at the time, at least on the surface, there's still a unified front when it comes to the Palestine question and supporting the Palestinian people, even if it doesn't get translated into supporting the Palestinian people militarily at this stage. But you have, people like Nasser putting their weight behind the idea that we're not going to give up the right of return. We're not going to do resettlement. We're going to insist on a repatriation of the Palestinian refugees. We're going to insist on national political rights for them. These are, of course, all of his moves are connected to mobilizations by these refugees themselves, as we've seen earlier. But so on multiple levels, we have the radical movements in the left make major strides. And that's important to remember. However, that was these countries, none of these countries was rich enough or powerful enough to be able to change the overall game that was being played in this region. You still had a very entrenched and powerful imperial Western presence in the region. The West could rely on a NATO country, Turkey, that enters NATO and becomes very important in the Cold War. It relies on Iran and the Shah through, of course, suppressing the aspirations of the Iranian people by, overthrowing the democratically elected Mossadegh government, of course. it relies on also controlling the countries that have the richest resource, the most important resource in the world, which is oil. And the regimes they oversee have the benefit of a certain geopolitical stability that can be afforded by having a great power, a superpower backer. If you're backed by the United States fully, and if you were earlier backed by Britain, you already have a stabilizing presence as a force. You have somebody that could fund you if you fall. You have somebody that could arm you. You have somebody that could give you diplomatic cover. And that's an important part of the story of the stability of Arab governments in the conservative states that were allied with the West. And often the story of the Arab left is told through their prism. They'll say, look, unlike these people that were constantly fighting with each other, we remained stable and we offered our people stability and wealth and so on. But in reality, that stability was not internally generated. That was, of course, came out of the loss of a substantial element of national sovereignty. So you had this dimension being played out. And of course, its other price was extreme inequality. And its other price was a lack of interest in any form of social justice or political justice or just causes on the anti-colonial level. So, such as Palestine, but also, it was not the Saudis that facilitated the Algerian Revolution. Nasser did, So, they helped a little bit, but they played a minor role compared to it. So that's the reality of when we make a general assessment of what the left was confronting and what it achieved in that period. These are some of the issues that we have to take note of. Of course, there are many others, but we obviously would need an entire podcast just for that.
This was the 11th episode of Thawra, the Dig series on 20th century Arab politics with Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. A scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements, he's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website, an incredible resource that'll be back online soon. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that revolutions are the locomotives of history, while other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roche. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thierry Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and now also Instagram at thedigradio. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. And if it's on iTunes or Spotify or wherever, also rate and review us. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. But what really and truly makes that happen is you telling other people who you know to check out the pod, particularly Thawra. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.